There are 4 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as a participant. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
Good morning and welcome to the FEMA Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Webinar Series. My name is Allison Albright and I'm the Regional Preparedness Liaison for FEMA Region 2. I'm going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's proceedings are being recorded and captioned. The archived event will be available on the FEMA website in the coming weeks. You should hear audio through your computer speakers, so please ensure your speaker icon is green and your volume is turned up so you may hear the proceedings accordingly. In the top right, we ask if you'd like to receive news and updates from Region 2. If so, please enter your email address and we'll be sure to add you to the distribution list. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation concludes. You'll see a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matter there, and time permitting, we'll do our best to answer them. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation from today will be available for you to download in the file share pod as a PDF. You can click on the file and download it using the download button. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the Region 2 Community Preparedness Officer to introduce our speaker and today's proceedings.
Thanks, Allison. Do you know if you live in a hurricane evacuation zone? Is your insurance up to date? It's Hurricane Preparedness Week, a reminder to ensure that you and your family are prepared for hurricane season. Good morning. I'm Debbie Costa, the Community Preparedness Officer for FEMA Region 2. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, I'd like to welcome you to our Preparedness Webinar Series. The Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Program is focused on preparing individuals and communities for disasters by providing useful information and training, inspiring people to act and be ready for any emergency. Today's webinar will cover hurricane basics, information, resources, and how to find out if you live in a hurricane evacuation zone. Our speaker will also discuss preparedness measures for people living in hurricane-prone areas, such as emergency supplies, insurance, repairing your home, and making an individual or family hurricane plan. Chris Moore is the Hurricane Program Manager and Regional Hurricane Liaison Team Lead for FEMA Region 2. He joined FEMA in 2016 after 4 years as the State Hurricane Program Manager and 2 years as the Deliberate Planning Unit Supervisor with the Texas Division of Emergency Management. In these roles, he provided hurricane preparedness training, led the team that developed the state's emergency operation plans, and supported numerous exercises and disaster response. Chris began in emergency management as an American Red Cross Disaster Action Team volunteer in 2000 and supported 9/11 recovery in 2001 as a Red Cross caseworker and outreach volunteer in New York, New York. Since joining FEMA, Chris responded to Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria in incident management and incident support roles, in addition to the 2020 Puerto Rico earthquakes and the COVID-19 response in New York City. Chris, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Deb. How are you? How's my audio?
Your audio sounds great, and I'm well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk to you this morning about getting ready for hurricane season. So this is the 2021 Hurricane Preparedness Week, and so this is the time when we encourage everyone to make their preparations for the upcoming hurricane season, which begins on June 1st. Given that we're doing, a webinar here, we're going to hold the questions till the end, but, please, if you have questions, feel free to submit them, and, we'll try to cover, the majority of the content from the questions that we receive at the end of the webinar. So the first part of hurricane preparedness is knowing your risk. So we're going to talk a little bit about when, where, and how tropical cyclones form. And, for those who are curious, a tropical cyclone refers to, a tropical depression, a tropical storm, or a hurricane. So the peak of hurricane season in the Atlantic is normally around September 10th. And you can see from this graphic, there's a pretty good peak, both hurricanes and tropical storms and hurricanes around that September 10th time frame. And the reason for this is because that's when the ocean is holding the most heat, during the summer months. So you see, from June 1st, the official start of hurricane season, until the end of November, you can get, tropical cyclone activity. You get kind of a secondary peak in October, but for the Atlantic, September 10th is when we get the most activity and, the most threat that we have to look out for. So that's kind of the when. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the where. So in June, you get the activity kind of starting in, the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, which can move across the Florida Peninsula and into the Atlantic. So on average, about, one storm every other year forms in June. But, really the beginning of hurricane season, it's the Gulf where, we're kind of keeping the most focus. Getting into July, you actually have less storms in July than you do in June. You open up, kind of this area down in the Caribbean that can move either into the Gulf or off the U.S. East Coast. But, really, the activity kind of dips in July from June. Moving into August, you see, the entire Atlantic basin kind of opens up. So on average, you get about 2 to 3 storms forming each year in August, and you see the start of the typical Cape Verde season for hurricanes, where you get that progression off of the west coast of Africa, the Cape Verde Islands, of those disturbances moving across the Atlantic, which could impact either the Gulf or the U.S. East Coast. And then in September, as I mentioned, the peak of hurricane season, you see the most tropical cyclone activity. Typically, pretty much anywhere in the Atlantic basin is fair game during September for tropical cyclones. So this is really, when we see the most activity and when we're usually the most busy, as emergency managers. You start to see that level off in October. As I mentioned, kind of the heat in the ocean, is the reason for the peak activity. The heat kind of starts to, bleed off, and the ocean's cool in October. And so you see a little bit less tropical cyclone activity, but still, the entire, basin is potentially, going to be active in a given year. You kind of see the peak activity move toward the Western Caribbean, which could, again, impact the Gulf, the Florida Peninsula and the east coast of the U.S. And then into November, you see much less activity, typically moving off the east coast. So that's kind of the where, in comparison with the when in terms of hurricane season. But it's important to note that tropical cyclones can form any time of year. And, the hurricane threat is something that we need to continually watch for, at any point. Just because climatologically we see these patterns, it doesn't mean that a tropical cyclone can't affect where you are, at any given time. So it's important to keep track of your information resources and the media to watch out for potential tropical cyclone threats. Okay, so we talked about the where and the when. So let's talk a little bit about the how. So I'm going to compare the ingredients for tropical cyclone formation to the analogy of an automobile. So you need certain things in order for a car to run on the road. You need the car itself. You need a spin. You need a windshield. You need fuel. And, you need oil. You need a conducive environment for that engine to run. So we're going to go through each of these, but, the analogy of the car is kind of going to be the base for, how we talk about the building blocks of tropical cyclones that could eventually become hurricanes. So the frame of the car is an existing disturbance. So every year, climatologically, we see disturbances moving off the west coast of Africa, and those are referred to as tropical waves. I've heard different numbers for these, but typically we get around 60 or so tropical waves move off the west coast of Africa, across the Atlantic, toward the Caribbean and the U.S. Gulf or Atlantic coast. We get about 60 of those each year. So these tropical waves are about 70% of all of the formations of Atlantic hurricanes. You also see some decaying cold fronts and non-tropical lows being the foundations or the base of tropical systems. So you need an existing, thunderstorm activity disturbance in order for a hurricane to form. And there are plenty, but most of them come from these tropical waves during, the peak times, the peak months of the hurricane season. And so here you see the typical progression of a Cape Verde storm. You get a tropical disturbance coming across from the west coast of Africa, becoming a tropical depression and a tropical storm, and then a hurricane, hopefully staying away from land areas, and then, basically, becoming extratropical or dissipating off of the U.S. East Coast. So this is just a normal part of nature where, the heat from the ocean has to dissipate and move northward. And so we're going to continue to see hurricanes, hopefully, in any given season. The biggest and baddest of those hurricanes stay well off the East Coast and don't impact, the folks in the Caribbean. So climatologically, here over the last, 170 or so years, since 1851, here are the historical hurricane tracks. And so this graphic shows that pretty much anywhere in the Atlantic Basin is vulnerable, and it's going to happen again. Will be impacted by tropical cyclones. But it also shows another interesting factor, which is that you don't see tropical cyclone activity near the equator. So down near South America, you don't see any tracks down there. And that's another one of the fundamental requirements for tropical cyclone formation, which is the rotation of the Earth. If you've looked at, water circling around a drain, and you see that whirlpool, you're familiar with the Coriolis effect, which is due to the angular momentum from the rotation of the Earth. And what that does is it causes the spinning motion of, both water and air in the atmosphere. So you have to get a certain distance away from the equator for that spin to take place. You might be aware that if you go to the southern hemisphere of the Earth, the water spins in a different direction, spins clockwise as opposed to counterclockwise up here in the northern hemisphere. And so that's the reason why you don't see tropical cyclone activity near the equator, is because you don't get that spin. And, realize that this is kind of technical going through this, but, this might be, an idea that spurs, more thought and research about, how tropical cyclones form. I mentioned already the sea surface temperatures. The heat that gets held in the ocean is really the fuel for hurricane formation. So this heat propagates up into the atmosphere. You get warmer, less dense air rising. Warm air rises, cooler, more dense air falls. And so this begins the motion of the cyclone itself. You combine this warm air rising and cold air falling with the Coriolis effect, and that storm starts to spin. And that's how tropical cyclones become hurricanes. One of the other factors that influences whether or not a storm becomes, powerful is, and then the analogy of the car, it's the windshield, is the vertical wind shear. So if you imagine the atmosphere at different altitudes, it can be all going the same direction, or it can be going in different directions. And it varies, depending upon the weather conditions. And so if a tropical cyclone is in a condition where, you have a pretty stable atmosphere at different atmospheric levels, then it's more conducive. If you get the air blowing different directions, if you get wind blowing one direction at low altitudes and a different direction at higher altitudes, then that can shear the storm apart. That can, cause it to, kind of disrupt the environment. Think about it if that analogy of you see a drain in a sink and you have a whirlpool form. You need a relatively calm environment in the water to start seeing that whirlpool. If you run your hand through the water, then that whirlpool disappears. So the same thing is, pretty much applies to tropical cyclone formation. If you have, a vertical, atmospheric conditions that are relatively calm, it's more conducive for tropical cyclone formation. So we talked about these factors for intensity. Basically, the warmer the water, the more fuel it has, the more intense it can get. What we didn't talk about was the interaction with land. Interaction with land causes more disruption in the wind environment. So typically you see storms get weaker when they cross the land area. They can intensify over water, and then, when a storm interacts with land, they tend to become weaker. We talked about the vertical wind shear with, different directions and the more shear limiting the strengthening potential for a storm. Moisture in the storm environment is something we didn't really talk about. You see climatologically when you have the Saharan dust, typically in the early months of the season, that creates, an environment that's not as conducive because you don't have the moisture that supports the hurricane formation. And that really is kind of with the analogy of the oil for the car. It kind of provides, the lubricant for the storm to start spinning and to form and intensify. Due to the time constraints, we can't really get into, the structural changes and how storms can kind of, pulsate as they strengthen due to eye wall replacement cycles. But that's another thing that if you're interested, you can kind of look more into. And then interactions with other weather systems. Obviously, the tropical cyclones can be the dominant weather feature in a given scenario. But the weather, around it and in other parts of the Atlantic and the globe, has an impact on where they go, how they form, and whether they intensify. So that was kind of an overview on understanding the threat, when, where, and how tropical cyclones form. There's kind of a lot of material there, but we kind of want to get more into how this impacts you, how it might impact your home, your preparedness for this upcoming hurricane season. So we're going to talk a little bit about the hazards and what to prepare for. So here you see the 5 hazards associated with hurricanes. Most people think of wind first and foremost because hurricanes are graded primarily on the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is a wind scale. That doesn't really equate to hazards other than wind. So if you're talking about storm surge or the waves and rip currents, the potential tornadoes, or the inland flooding, there could be wide variability. Even if it's a tropical storm, these other hazards can be significant. A Cat 2 storm surge, can vary significantly from, not, a few feet to over 20 feet, depending on where you are. And so it's important to acknowledge each of these hazards independently. And remember that the Saffir-Simpson scale, if you talk about a Category 3 storm or a Category 5 storm, we're only really talking about the wind. And you need to look at the other hazards on their own to determine your potential risk where you live. Another factor to take into consideration is that you typically get the severest impacts in the right front quadrant of the storm. So in whatever direction the storm is moving, if you're in the northern hemisphere, due to that spin, that counterclockwise, spin of the storm, you get the strongest winds, the most storm surge, the most tornadoes, and the most severe weather in the right front quadrant. So in this graphic, it would be, here to the north, and if the storm is moving westward, here in that north and westward right front quadrant of the storm is where you're going to get the worst impacts that could potentially do the most damage and have the most life-threatening potential. So for the U.S., just remember that right front quadrant is where you should take notice. But given the the uncertainties with forecasting, you never quite know where that right front quadrant is going to be until it impacts land. So I mentioned the Saffir-Simpson scale. Here you see the different categories of storms. Most of you are probably familiar with these categories, and you can look into what they are. They've kind of been standardized for a long time, and the impacts, even a Cat 1 storm can produce significant damaging impacts. Well-constructed homes typically have roof damage. If they're made of wood, you get large trees that'll break and damage the power lines and poles. Typically, power distribution impacts can last for a few to several days. If you're in the continental U.S., if they can drive there and fix it, they typically get distribution back online, pretty quickly. If you look at a Cat 1 and other places, especially the island environment, where they might have to bring in resources over, by sea, you might have longer power outages, even from a Category 1 storm. Moving to a major hurricane, which is Category 3, winds of 111 miles per hour or greater, you see devastating damage. So even, well-built homes can incur major damage. You see in the graphic to the lower left, this NASA building in Cape Canaveral, Florida, that has the facade, with tiles, torn away by the wind. Hurricane Rita in Orange, Texas, completely destroying wooden structures, causing devastating impacts for the people who live there as a major hurricane. And then you get up to Category 5 range, you see complete devastation where, during Hurricane Andrew and Felix in Nicaragua, you see down in South Dade, in the Homestead area of Florida, in the lower right, complete destruction of this neighborhood due to wind impacts alone. So this is where the category of the storm really matters, is when you're talking about the wind impacts. So moving on, we talked about how most people think about hurricanes in terms of the wind, but I want to talk more about the most potential damaging and deadly hazard, which is storm surge. So this is Waveland, Mississippi, after Hurricane Katrina, and you see just the complete devastation here along the coastline. All of the structures that were here completely washed away. You see kind of the foundations of these structures. And then if you move one panel inland, you see the high water mark of where all that debris collected. And so this just shows the immense power of water along the coastline, and how storm surge, as the most potentially damaging and deadly hazard, is the primary reason why we evacuate the coastline. So this is why it's important for everyone to understand their storm surge risk. And fortunately for most of us, we don't live in storm surge areas, but if you live close to saltwater, you should take a look at your hurricane evacuation zones to determine, where you fall and if you potentially need to, make evacuation plans, due to this storm surge risk. The next hazard we'll talk about is wave and rip currents. So in some years, we get storms that don't impact land. In other years, such as last year, we get multiple storms that impact land, but the majority of the public evacuates from those threats. And so you can see a larger loss of life, unfortunately, from offshore effects, from folks being out in the water, during times when there are rip currents and waves. So it's very important to, even if a storm is going to stay offshore, to message the potential threats of waves and rip currents, and as a member of the public to stay off the beaches and out of the water whenever these threats are present. Freshwater flooding is also a major contributor to loss of life from tropical cyclones. So in the years when people evacuate for storm surge pretty well, you can kind of get periods where the most damage and the most loss of life is from the rain, is from freshwater flooding. That includes landslides and mudslides. And for the folks in the Caribbean, this really is the majority of the water threat, from tropical cyclones. You get, the freshwater flooding from the rain that, moves the earth, you get landslides and mudslides that can potentially cause damage to, to houses and to other structures, which is a much bigger concern than the storm surge. If you get up in the northeast part of FEMA Region 2 and along the U.S. Gulf and East Coast, the storm surge flooding risk from salt water can potentially be the bigger flooding threat. But, as you go inland, you have to watch for the rain. There are several factors that contribute to that. The forward speed of the storm, how fast it's moving. The longer a storm sits over where you are, the more potential rain you're going to see. The next threat we'll cover is tornadoes. And so this is a threat that we should all be aware of when a tropical cyclone is coming ashore. 70% of tropical cyclones, cause at least one tornado, and 40% produce more than 3 tornadoes. Some hurricanes cause a lot of tornadoes, like Hurricane Ivan in 2004. So this kind of depends upon the interaction with other weather factors, but it's something to be aware of that, even though the tornadoes are typically on the lower side of the scale, EF0 or EF1 tornadoes, if a tropical cyclone is coming ashore and impacting, your area, even far inland, that disturbed weather can potentially cause, tornado activity that should cause people to take shelter and be ready. So that's the hurricane hazards. And now, given that information about what the potential threats are that we could face, I want to talk a little bit about the information resources that are out there available to the public so that you can help you make the decisions that you have to make to protect your homes and your families. So the majority of this is going to be the National Hurricane Center products and services that are publicly available at www.hurricanes.gov, which is really the best source for official information about the potential hurricane tracks, intensity, and impacts. The first product that I want to talk about is the Tropical Outlook. So there are 2 products. They give a 2-day and a 5-day outlook. These show all of the active tropical cyclones in the Atlantic Basin and then any areas of potential formation. So you see in this graphic here, you have like an 80% chance of a tropical cyclone forming from this system, from this disturbance, and then a 20% chance of this disturbance behind it coming off of the west coast of Africa. So if you're watching the weather during hurricane season, this is the best way to see areas that could potentially become tropical cyclones that may impact, U.S. interests. And then, you see the tropical cyclones that are active in the basin, like Florence at this point. This 2-day product shows the satellite imagery, so you can kind of see the disturbances themselves. And then when you go to the 5-day product, you have kind of the same format, but with a percentage chance of formation. But these polygons here, are, these ovals show the potential formation area as well. So they're color-coded, red, orange, and yellow. So you see here you have a high chance of a tropical cyclone forming in this area and a medium chance of a tropical cyclone forming in this orange area from this disturbance that's centered just on the west coast of Africa. So this is the best way to look ahead, www.hurricanes.gov for the 2- and 5-day tropical weather outlooks. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the products for when a tropical cyclone is actually formed in the Atlantic Basin. So when a storm becomes a tropical cyclone, which is a tropical depression, tropical storm, or a hurricane, the National Hurricane Center will initiate advisories on that system. And as long as it's a tropical cyclone, you can expect those advisories to come at regular intervals. So if you're on the U.S. East Coast or in the Caribbean, if you're on Atlantic Standard Time during most of the season, or East Coast Daylight Savings Time, you get those updates at 5 and 11, 5 a.m., 11 a.m., 5 p.m., and 11 p.m. At these intervals, at these times, you get the full suite of National Hurricane Center products, including the forecast advisories, the discussions. You get a new set of wind speed probabilities, the graphical products, and storm surge products. So 4 times a day, you'll get an update as to where they think that storm is going, how strong they forecast it to be, and when it gets close to land, you'll get products that, that forecast the potential impacts. So just important to remember, look for updates at 5 and 11 if you're on the East Coast. If you happen to be in the central time zone, if you're in the Gulf, those would come 1 hour earlier, 4 and 10. But for our Region 2 folks, just remember 5 and 11. So the NHC, they provide that suite of products for tropical cyclones, as I mentioned, but they also provide it for post-tropical cyclones. And Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, is a good example of this case where technically the storm went post-tropical. That means it wasn't getting its energy off of the ocean heat anymore when it was coming ashore. That didn't mean that it wasn't a devastating weather feature and a devastating storm for the East Coast. And so in order to warn the public, the National Hurricane Center will continue to issue its advisories and its other products for cyclones that go post-tropical. For most people, it doesn't really matter, whether a storm is a cyclone or a post-tropical cyclone. What matters is the potential hazards. And so that's part of why the Hurricane Center continues to issue its warnings for cyclones that are technically not hurricanes anymore. Also, the National Hurricane Center can issue its suite of products for potential tropical cyclones. So these are storms that have not yet become a tropical depression or a tropical storm, but they're forecast to pose a threat to land within 2 days, and they're forecast to be a tropical cyclone. So you'll see, potentially the full suite of NHC products for these potential tropical cyclones that could become a threat within 2 days. Talk a little bit about this graphical product. So a lot of you have probably seen this. Most media outlets kind of replicate these graphical products, but this is the one that's from the official National Hurricane Center website. So there's a lot to take in this graphic, but it looks pretty simple. I think most people can see that there's a storm threat, there's a direction it's moving, and there's an area where it's forecast to impact. Down here, you see the storm itself and the wind field. You have the hurricane force wind field in darker orange and the tropical storm force wind field in lighter orange. You have the direction that the storm is moving represented by an error cone. You have the forecasted intensity at each of these points, and you see that, right now it's forecast to become a major hurricane, which is Category 3 or above, by 2 p.m. on Wednesday, and maintain that strength throughout landfall. You see the hurricane warning area here in red, which is the area that is, could potentially or is forecast to receive hurricane force winds, where hurricane force winds are expected within the next 36 hours. And you see the, the rest of the error cone, which shows the eventual movement out to 5 days. So a lot of information in this graphic. The main feature here, the error cone. It can be a little bit complicated, but want to cover what the error cone actually means. So the error cone is a 2/3 probability for where the center of the storm will track. That means that there is a 2/3 or about 66% chance that the storm track will stay within this cone, within the bounds of this area. That means that there's a 1/3 chance that it'll track outside of this area. When the Hurricane Center is putting this graphic together, they're looking at their statistical forecast error over the last 5 years. So this error cone doesn't speak to the certainty of that particular forecast. You could have models that all show the same thing. You have models all over the place. It doesn't impact how wide the error cone is. The error cone really just shows the statistical error over the last 5 years of that one track that the Hurricane Center is drawing based upon their analysis of where the storm is going to go. You see how the error cone is kind of developed. They look at the forecast points going out for 5 days, and that statistical error is each of the circles along that track. And you see that the edges of that error cone are, kind of correspond to the edges of the circles at each of those forecast points. One of the most important things to remember about this error cone is that you can have impacts well outside. In this particular graphic, you see the error cone is very small down here in the Caribbean. You have the Caribbean islands that are just on the edge of this error cone, but they're going to see significant impacts from this storm because the wind field is much larger, the rainfall, the storm surge, the tornado threat extends well beyond the edges of this error cone. Moving on, in the interest of time, so there are a few more graphical products that we want to quickly cover. This one that I'm showing is relatively new development over the last several years. This is the kind of wind timing arrival graphic that also shows the wind speed probabilities. So this gives you a good idea of the earliest reasonable and the most likely arrival of tropical storm force winds, which are winds, of 39 miles per hour or greater sustained that can potentially cause damage or threat to life and property. So this will show you, these graphics show you when that's anticipated to happen at all the locations along the storm track. They also show the probability of seeing those wind intensities you can see in the color-coded graphics. So this is a really good graphic to use for planning, what potential activities you need to take where you're at, because they show you what the forecast, time of arrival and, potential for getting those hazardous impacts at all areas along the forecast. Other forecast factors to keep in mind, the hurricane watches and warnings. Hurricane watch means that those conditions are possible within 2 days. hurricane warning means that hurricane conditions are expected within 36 hours. Depending on where you're at, there are a lot of preparatory activities that you may need to take before the watches and warnings are issued. But the hurricane watch and hurricane warning are kind of a notification, a warning from the National Weather Service that people need to take action to protect themselves, their homes, and their loved ones. Storm surge watches and warnings are a little bit newer, but follow the same pattern. A storm surge watch means you have the possibility of life-threatening saltwater flooding within 2 days. A storm surge warning means you have the danger of that within 36 hours. So these are graphical products here you see on the right that show, in the darker color, a storm surge warning, and then the lighter color, a storm surge watch here to the north. So if you live in coastal areas, these are the warning from the National Weather Service that you have to take into consideration with even more potential, deadly impacts than the wind. Finally, if you want to really look into the reasoning of the forecast itself, you can look to the forecast discussion. So all of the graphical products, for folks who are used to them, can show you what the forecast is showing in terms of where it's going, when it's going to be there, how strong it's going to be, what the potential impacts are. The forecast discussion gives you insight into the reasoning for that forecast, the confidence the forecaster has based upon the information that they have at their disposal. They'll talk about the model guidance here, their observations, and their uncertainty. So if you really want to see the reasoning behind those graphical products, the National Hurricane Center puts it out there in their forecast discussion, which you can read with every advisory. And to be honest, in my line of work, the forecast discussion is probably where I spend the most time with each advisory, trying to discern, the 5 W's of the forecast. Okay, so we talked about the resources, the information resources that are out there from the National Hurricane Center. Before we go to questions and potential thoughts, we want to talk about some things that you can do, given your knowledge about your potential threat. So if you live in a coastal area, it's absolutely important to know your zone. So for evacuation planning, your local emergency management office or your state emergency management office, depending on where you're living, maintains your hurricane evacuation plans and your hurricane evacuation zones. They are the trusted source and the official source for evacuation orders. A lot of times they'll tell you, the best routes to take, and it's important to know this information before the season begins so that you can be ready to leave on relatively short notice if you have to. Typically, these are the foundation for those plans. You get storm surge maps that show how far inland the water can go based upon, given intensity of storm. For most folks, this map, provides good information, but doesn't necessarily give you instructions on what to do. So what emergency managers do is they take those maps and pair them with their local knowledge and the potential hazards from, flooding and wind, and that helps them delineate evacuation zones based on that storm surge threat. Most of the time, the biggest consideration is you don't want to leave anyone underwater. So you want to be sure that you evacuate the full area that is vulnerable to storm surge. And so that's how jurisdictions kind of start to develop their evacuation zones. And there are lots of examples of these. I've got a couple of them here. One is Atlantic County, where you see the storm surge zones delineated by, landmarks, by roadways, by, geographic area in a way that makes sense to the public. And that's really one of the most important factors, is that, the public can make sense of what evacuation zone they live in. You see another example from the Houston-Galveston area in Texas here to the right. This map was built around zip codes with the thought that, folks might have trouble picking out where they live on this map, but pretty much everybody knows what zip code they live in. So this can help people know, which storm surge evacuation area they might fall in, and respond better when the government might have to order those evacuations. Another example from the New York City area shows, in high population density, the storm surge zones can get sort of complicated because, it can be really tough to pick out which block you live in on this map. And so, what New York City has done is provided a web resource where people can type in their address, and it will tell you, which storm surge zone that address falls in. So that can, be a really good way for the public to, get information on, where they fall within the threat area before the storm season begins. And they can know that when their zone is called, that they need to take action. So knowing your zone, knowing whether you have to evacuate is probably the biggest factor, so that you can protect the lives of your families, your loved ones, and your neighbors. We want to talk about some of the other things that we can all do to get ready for hurricane season. One thing that, pretty much everyone should do, regardless of where they fall in, in hurricane threat areas, whether you live in a place that can be impacted by tropical cyclones or not, is to prepare a kit, have disaster supplies on hand and ready all times of the year. And especially if you live in a hurricane evacuation zone, you want to have your kit ready so that you can, easily load it in your vehicle or take with you if you need to evacuate. This includes, food and water for evacuation, and if you don't live in an evacuation zone, for sheltering in place, if you potentially might not have power for a given time period. You want to make sure before hurricane season that you filled your prescriptions, that you keep your electronic devices charged, you keep your vehicles fueled. Down along the coast, we tell folks, to keep their car, their gas tank more than half full throughout hurricane season. It's also, probably a good idea to keep some cash on hand, in case the electronic, systems are down and you can't get to an ATM immediately. You also, if you live in an area prone to storm impacts, you want to check your insurance. You want to, talk with your insurance providers before the hurricane season and get to know your insurance policies. Keep in mind that your, federal flood insurance is separate from typical insurance policies. So if you want to, insure your home against storm surge flooding or even freshwater flooding, there's a separate program to ensure that most policies don't cover. You want to get your home and vehicles ready. You want to have copies of your insurance policies as part of the documents that you have ready to take with you, and put copies, maybe both electronic and in hard copy with your evacuation kit. Before the storm season, you want to prepare your home. Make sure your trees are trimmed, that any of those dead limbs that could potentially, fall on your home or get blown, and become a potential missile, depending on where you live from those hurricane winds. You want to make sure that those trees are trimmed, that you take care of all of the outdoor items. If you have chairs or tables on your deck or your balcony, that you move those. You can move those indoors pretty quickly. You want to make sure that your windows are covered. A lot of people down on down in Florida have the hurricane shutters. You want to make sure that your windows are up to par if you're along the coast, or you have shutters that can protect you. And then have an idea of where you can park your vehicle so that, if a storm does blow through, it's going to be in the safest possible location. You also want to support your neighbors. So getting to know your neighbors, folks who might have, trouble with collecting, the supplies necessary, the best people to help, to help each other are our communities, are our neighbors. And so if your neighbors are having trouble and a storm is coming, you're the first and best, responders to help them prepare, to give them the supplies they need, potentially to assist with evacuation if they don't have a way to get out of the threat area. And then remember, after the storm passes, to check on your neighbors because as we've seen in the past several years, you see more significant loss of life after the storm. People take care of themselves and can weather the storm, but after the storm, you see a lot of tragedy. And so it's really important to check on your neighbors, before, during, and, well, not during, but before and after the storm. Okay, so that concludes the presentation that I have. So I guess at this point we can go to question and answer. I'll open it back up.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I often wondered what the heck the cone of error was. I appreciate you taking the time to go over all this with us today. We do have some questions for you. What are the requirements for emergency preparation regarding pre-storage of emergency supplies and drinking water?
Okay, so the requirements, I don't think there are requirements, but I think the recommendations are that everyone has 72 hours or 3 days worth of food and water and supplies for every member of their household and their pets. So, I think that most people don't keep that much food and water on hand necessarily, but if you have 3 days worth of food and water for your family and your pets set aside, you're probably doing pretty well. You're doing, kind of the minimum recommendation. The requirements, just think ahead to what you could potentially face. I think it's kind of subjective. Everybody should prepare as much as they can, for a potential time when they can't get to a store or, turn on the tap water.
Yeah, and I think they also forget to take water into consideration for sanitary purposes, not just drinking purposes.
Absolutely.
How can we determine what the right front quadrant is when we hear the report? I don't think I remember anyone specifically stating those words before, so what would we look for with an untrained eye?
That's a great question. So you want to look at the direction of travel, and this only applies to the northern hemisphere, which is pretty much all of probably the audience where we live. Whether you're in the Caribbean, if you're on the Atlantic or Gulf Coast, the storms move, pretty much from east to west, and they move counterclockwise. So on the direction of travel, you look at the storm track, and the right front quadrant will be on the right side and the front side of that storm track. So no matter where that line is going, look to the right of that track and look to the front of that track, and it'll normally be, in most cases, it'll normally be on the northwest side of that storm if it's impacting our area. But if it's, if it's in the Gulf, it can be on the northeast. You just want to look where it's going and then look to the right and the front.
Gotcha. Thank you. Where do you recommend signing up for tropical storm and hurricane alert?
So your local National Weather Service office is the best source of information on the potential hazards to your area. A lot of them maintain, several methods of outreach on social media. I would recommend going to their webpage on the internet, which can direct you to, potential social media outlets. That way you can have, better direct access to the information that's impacting your area. Also, if you're looking ahead, I would recommend, the outlets, the information from the National Hurricane Center. They more focus on the eventual, track and intensity. So before a storm even approaches land, the National Hurricane Center, they have, a Twitter page, they have Facebook, they've got, all kinds of social media. They've got their official website. You can sign up for alerts. I just go to their webpage, and then the same thing is true of the local Weather Service office where you live. And the National Weather Service all work together on their forecasts, so you can, count on consistent information as the storm approaches or potentially approaches where you live.
Gotcha. How do you think COVID-19 would impact hurricane response this year?
That's a great question. So it was last year was a tremendous example of the collaboration between the Weather Service and emergency managers. In a COVID environment, we were able to share the warning. It seems like Louisiana and the Gulf Coast took the brunt of the impacts from last year's record-setting hurricane season. And this helped them, that collaboration helped them to prepare for the challenges with evacuation, which, include predominantly the non-congregate sheltering, which is, typically we can, accommodate people in a shelter in relatively close quarters. But in a COVID environment, you want to ensure that, you maintain social distancing and you don't, potentially spread the pandemic. So this is something that was exercised and performed last year relatively well. For the emergency managers involved in hurricane response, it's constantly on the forefront of how we do business. Is how do we do what we do in a COVID environment. So besides the non-congregate sheltering, it's really just trying to encourage the public to be more ready, more personally, prepared, so that they can take care of themselves. Make sure that your car is gassed up, so that you don't have to stop for fuel. Make sure that you know where you're going to go. Make sure that you have the resources on hand, so that you don't have to go to the store and crowd in with a bunch of people buying their hurricane supplies at the last minute. So just encouraging that public preparedness and accounting for the fact that we have to do what we do in a different environment with the sanitary measures and the social distancing that can keep everyone safe.
Thank you. What do you think for this season? Do you expect it to be as active as last year, more active than last year? What are we looking at?
Another great question. So NOAA will produce its tropical weather outlook in the third week of May, and that will be the official, kind of forecast for the, for what we're looking at as far as how active the season could be. They look at a lot of different factors for that. This could be a whole presentation unto itself as to how they determine how active the season could be. But needless to say, that forecast or that outlook will be out in the third week of May. At this point, there's no official word on how active the season could be. But what I'll say is that, if a storm impacts your area, it's going to be an active season. It only takes one storm to be an active season. There are several years that are good examples of this. 1991 with Hurricane Andrew, there were only 3 tropical cyclones, but Andrew devastated communities in South Florida. So that was a very active year for those communities. So it's important to be prepared, regardless of how active the season is forecast to be.
Totally agree. I have somebody, one of our listeners coordinates emergency preparedness team at their church, and they need to kind of set up and designate responsibilities to team members and resources for training. Does FEMA have any resources, or do you know of any place where someone could go for guidance who maybe is new to emergency management and needs kind of a crash course in hurricane preparedness before the season's on us?
I would recommend reaching out to your local community emergency management office first. So a lot of times there are CERT programs in local areas that, organizations, whether, they're faith-based or nonprofit or, or volunteer, they can look to their local emergency management office and the programs that they have going on in their local community. If there aren't any, such programs going on, oftentimes, faith-based communities can start those type of programs. And Debbie, I think, you guys in preparedness are probably have a better answer to where folks could go. FEMA.gov, ready.gov, can kind of give you a start. But, there are lots of resources available. And if you have more to say on that, I'd turn it over to you.
Yeah, I don't know of any, ready.gov is a lot about individual and family preparedness and, doing plans. I haven't really seen anything, more detailed, sort of like some of the COOP plans and templates. What does an emergency preparedness committee look like? We might, if you want to send us an email, we'll see if we can't find you a better resource. But I definitely think Chris was on the money when he said, reach out to your local emergency management office. So regardless of the town you live in, there is somebody who is in that role and wears that hat, and they could probably give you the best direction. But if you need to, you're happy to, reach out to us and see what we could find. Allison will go to that screen in a few minutes. And we are out of time. I want to just look at these questions real fast. Yes, the recording is going to be available. Yes, the presentation is available. I don't know that FEMA has different presentation materials. I see, such as a video that OEM coordinators can use to educate the public, but I do know that there are resources like Chris mentioned on ready.gov by disaster type. So when you're on ready.gov, you could look up hurricanes and it'll show you, any kind of graphics or posters or infographics that might be available that you can share. And there are definitely some videos there as well. I'm going to ask Chris this one last question. How do you determine if you're located in the federal flood insurance coverage area? Do you by any chance know the best way to do that? We don't have our mitigation folks on the line today.
Yeah, I would refer that question to our mitigation folks. So we have federal flood insurance maps that are available across the country. One thing I will say is that they don't necessarily correlate to evacuation zones that are kind of managed at the local level. So for firm information, I would refer that to mitigation, but you can search for your your federal flood insurance mitigation area online.
Yeah, Alicia, I know there's a very easy answer to that question, and if you email us, we will ask one of our mitigation colleagues for that very simple answer, and we'll get that to you. I want to thank Chris again for taking the time. I know you're always super busy. I'm glad that we were able to get you pre-hurricane season this time around. Information always very valuable and helpful. We did have over 500 people joining us today, so that's proof positive. We do have some additional great webinars coming up. I'd like to highlight Until Help Arrives. If you haven't taken that training, it's a 2-hour training on how you are the help until the professionals can get there. What kind of information does 911 need? How do you stop the bleeding? How do you position the injured and keep yourself and the injured safe and provide comfort? It really, that 3 to 9 minutes, is very important once someone's injured before professionals get there, and you really can help save a life. So if you could join us this Thursday at noon, we'd love to have you. It is Older Americans Month, and we will be celebrating with lots of great webinars targeting not only older Americans as individuals, but also organizations that serve our seniors. So hopefully you will be available to join us for that. We have dam safety coming up. Preventing scams is always a good one to attend. You need a good disaster for all the good scams and scammers to come out of the woodwork. We will be hosting that on Thursday, May 27th. NJOHSMP is holding their virtual Houses of Worship security program, where we will have folks from NJOHSMP, FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security will be joining us. And I apologize, I'm one of the few people that still have a landline, and it normally doesn't ring during this. Oh, goodness. Okay. So I think with that, I'm going to just go to our links and get rid of my other phone. Our email address that I mentioned a few times, if anybody wants to reach out to us, is FEMA-R2prepares at FEMA.dhs.gov. And the links above are to see all our upcoming webinars and to see today's webinar. I saw a couple of people said, I missed the beginning, or I'd like to share today's webinar with some people that I work with. It's been recorded. Give us a week or two, but you could click on that second link and listen to today's recording in its entirety. Sorry for going 6 minutes late, but I thought it was important that we get through some of those questions. So thank you all for joining us today. You're free to drop. Have a great day.